It's my honor to introduce our presenter tonight. I had a conversation with him before this a couple weeks ago, and it was really exciting because he was the person that gets the convergence of everything that we're all doing here and the different storytelling mediums between film, music, interactive, social media, the whole thing. And not only does he get it, he works in it, and he's helping people take their stories and get it into multi-platforms in a way that is actually getting return on investment. So he's going to tell you stories, give you specifics, and one of my favorite things, and I hope you tell about it, Kraig, is how an LA entertainment lawyer is so different than a Seattle entertainment lawyer, because I thought it represented everything that we're trying to do here. So maybe you can interject that story if you weren't already. Anyway, give it up for Kraig Baker.
And I guess I'm going to cover all of that in 30 minutes, so I'll see what I can do here. James is right. So I practice in all three areas that are here: interactive, music, television, and film, and do that both locally and nationally for various clients. And one of the things that's different about practicing up here is that you have to really become an expert in multiple areas in order to find enough work. Where if you're in Los Angeles, you're a music lawyer, or you're a television lawyer. And if you're a television lawyer, that means that you can't be a film lawyer. And for some reason, even though many of these things will overlap, and particularly now as things converge in a across digital platforms, people in Los Angeles still haven't necessarily recognized that. So for some of these things, people will be asking for or getting multiple lawyers involved. Now, I'm going to talk about storytelling, and I want to cover this across all of the different platforms. This is going to be publishers if you're in interactive. These are distributors or studios. If you're in film, it's the labels or the publishers if you're in music. But it's basically all the big media companies that seem like large, faceless organizations that don't recognize your vision and don't recognize what's great about your property. I want to start by just reminding people, and I think that most people sort of recognize that this disruption is happening, but disruption is happening faster and faster. And the thing is that a lot of people in traditional media, across traditional media platforms and traditional media industries, are not necessarily recognizing all these things. So first of all, everybody wants their own content, right? And everybody wants to be, and because of social media, you now have the opportunity to actually interact with people who share that vision, and you're no longer constrained by geography. So for instance, if you're into heavy metal, it used to be that there was the other guy who was also into heavy metal in your high school and you would hang out. Well, if you're actually into Scandinavian death metal, I'm not, by the way, there are now places that you can go where you can share that love of that specific subset of subset of subset. If you remember Monty Python and the Life of Brian about the splitters, about all of the things, this is the first group that's actually gotten that reference. But you know, it's very much, you have these sort of subsets of subsets of subsets. But what that means is that for somebody who's producing content, you have to recognize how niche that content is. Everybody wants to take their content everywhere. And it's changed from being network-directed to user-directed. If you think about it, I presume almost everybody has a DVR or a box or of some kind where you actually are not watching television live. And how many of you know, A, when your favorite shows are on, what day they happen to be on, and what time they're on, and what is actually around that program? Do you know what precedes House or follows Two and a Half Men or whatever? You know, I would posit that most people don't anymore. Evidently, nobody watches Two and a Half Men, which is fine. I don't either. I'm just clearly, that was the wrong reference for this group. But I think it changes the interaction. So we are now, for instance, more passionate about individual content properties, less passionate about the distribution platforms in many cases, particularly the traditional distribution platforms. You don't love NBC, you love the programming on NBC. That was always the case, but only now are you actually, are those programmers and the people who own that content able to create platforms and create communities around that where they can basically break that off from the network. What that means is, one, it provides a wonderful opportunity for content creators to create those brands, but it, again, from a distributor standpoint, creates one more disruption, one more threat, and one more way that they're going to want to sort of collect content. When you combine that with this notion that transmedia is such a great play now, that most content properties either are or should be thinking about all of the different ways that you're going to leverage the content, all the different platforms. And it may be as something as simple as you have a comic book and a video game and a movie, and you work them all in, and they have common story elements, or it could be a completely cohesive story from beginning to end that works all sorts of different things, and maybe even turns into having sort of alternative reality gaming as part of it, where you're working in your real life with your virtual life as part of what you're doing, and you have this sort of comprehensive play. But I think most people have thought of transmedia historically as something that is tied to superheroes and science fiction and fantasy and that sort of genre. But you're starting to see a lot of people figure out other ways to really sort of leverage this concept of transmedia. And it's, again, if you think about digital as being a collection, you're collecting multiple pennies and they will add up to real money, this is one of the ways that you do it. Of course, those distributors are going to want to try and siphon those things off as much as they can. And then in production and distribution, I think one of the things that is the key change in distribution now is, and it's something that I don't know a lot of people have identified, is it used to be that the primary constraint to access to content was distribution. You could only put so many things in a warehouse. Your bookstore could only put so many books on the bookshelf. Your television program or television network only had so many slots. At this point, since everything's on demand, storage costs have fallen through the floor, and it's easy. You know, we now have ebooks, so we don't even need traditional publishers to actually print the books. It is now so easy to get content. The harder question is, there are millions of books on Amazon. How do I know which one to watch or to read? And how do I know what movie to watch on Netflix? Because once I get off the top 100, I don't recognize, all these things. How do I differentiate myself? Well, that means that what's important then are the curators, not the distributors. So it used to be that we focused on distribution and making sure that we get a distribution deal. At this point, you need a curation deal. And you need to think about, how do I get my content to the top of somebody's promotional list? How do I get a brand to produce or to promote my movie? How do I get that hip blogger who is a tastemaker to do this? How do I get some sort of fashion brand to sort of associate my content with their brand? Basically, how do you identify who those tastemakers are for your individual content and then break your content that way, as opposed to worrying about who's going to be responsible for distribution? Another thing that I think that, if you go and you get the little handbook about how to participate in the digital age and make sure that your content gets distributed and things like that, the thing that everyone says in the social media era is, make sure you build a community. Get people, get your fans behind what you're doing. And I will say to you, be careful what you wish for, because you have to understand what activating that community will be. First of all, not only will you have passionate fans who will want to promote your content, but you will have people who won't like it. And the same platforms that can promote your brand and promote your content can also undermine that. Everybody has a completely free, non-legal remedy for any complaint that they have now, and it's called a Twitter feed. So it's important then to think about how you're going to mobilize those fans. And at some level, your passionate fans may actually be the bigger problem than the people who want to attack your property. Because what happens if you kill off the character that they love? What happens if you go in the wrong direction? What happens if they want to develop a whole set of fan fiction that you've lost control of, you don't have the copyright of, but you can't enforce your copyright, and you alienate an entire swath of your community? These are really key dances that people undertake. Lucas has done a fantastic job over time managing their fan base. They will make available certain sort of elements of the Star Wars properties, and allow people to do fan films within certain sort of parameters. They will allow people, I think that they've ended up converting the history of the Star Wars universe, started out as a fan generated Wikipedia kinds of things, and now they've hired people essentially to manage the Star Wars iconography. And so but not all properties are going to approach it. Star Trek has gone the complete opposite direction and tends to be much more aggressive. You know, J.K. Rowling's been somewhere in the middle about trying to sort of not alienate fans and yet still manage that intellectual property. The thing is, if you are lucky enough to have that property with passionate fans, and again, if you're thinking about it in a transmedia world where you are doing storytelling across multiple platforms, you kind of want to preserve the ability to take your story in all sorts of different directions. But how do you do that if you've got other people who are interfering with what you're doing? ABC has done an interesting thing with Castle, right? They have their television program, but they have basically hired somebody to ghostwrite books in the name of the main character on Castle. They now have published 2 books, and they have a graphic novel that are tied to this. The 2 books have sold lots of copies. Well, what happens if you've got somebody else out there trying to generate fan fiction and, you know, ends up undermining what it is that you're trying to do, the brand and the story that you're trying to present through that property? So understanding what it is that your fans can do to you is going to be hard. And then, you know, the other thing, and this is very hard from the distributor perspective, is that everybody believes that they have something to say now. Everybody thinks that they're a content creator. If you look at the numbers on the web and you look at sort of the numbers of content consumers versus content creators, we're all both now, right? You know, it's something like, you know, 60 or 70% of the people who are online, you know, on social media platforms are also creating content for that social media. It may just be, you know, participating in a chat room, but there is an enormous amount of video, as anybody who has gone to YouTube knows, and there is a lot of it that's crap. And so from a distributor standpoint, how do you identify, how do you differentiate? It's the sort of reverse problem of the curation problem, which is I have a whole bunch of chaff, and how do I find the wheat kernels in that chaff? And that becomes one of the sort of really difficult things for marketing your content property. Now, I will say, I think, as opposed to 5 years ago, we've seen this rise of what I would call the quasi-professional. The people who are out there who are trying hard to do good content on a regular basis. They're consistent about what it is that they can and will do, and yet they're not necessarily people with regular brands going through regular channels. And I think people are more receptive to that, and especially as we've sort of democratized distribution channels, we're starting to see that happen more and more. But don't forget, you think that content's king because you're, for the most part, content creators. Distributors believe that they're actually in control and the curator's king, but really it's the consumer. And you forget that at your peril if you're not remembering that the consumer will basically manage whatever happens. And if you go too far one direction in terms of protecting your IP, they will flee to another property. If you're too loose, you'll lose control of it. If your whole business model is based on selling through within a limited channel, there's always BitTorrent, right? So there are lots of ways that the consumer will find their way around it. So what does that mean? I know that this is something that I actually suggested this earlier to somebody I was talking to before this, and said that I think that content creators need to think like technology startup founders. You need to think of your content as a brand. You need to think about what your business model is up front. You need to think about what your exit strategy is. Excuse me. How long are you in the business? How long are you going to push this property? What is am I going to sell exclusively so that I get a better rate of return but limit my platform? Am I going to sell non-exclusively? And what's critical is everybody has different goals. Maybe you want fame and fortune. Maybe you want money. Maybe you want to influence some sort of policy or group. But what's critical is recognizing what those are and then calibrating your goals and what you do to match what that result is. And I think a lot of people come, they have a creative idea, they come up with that idea, they develop it, and then they get done and they're like, okay, what do I do now? And I think that's a traditional model of the way a lot of people will do these things. But if you're going to record gospel music that's going to appeal to a relatively narrow audience, well, don't go and invest $25,000 in pressing a bunch of DVDs in today's market, because that just seems like a lot of money out of your pocket for probably what's not going to be a high rate of return. And so thinking about and judging sort of your burn rate, to use the technology startup concept, and calibrate that to sort of what you think is going to come out of it, I think is important. And so it is, I would suggest to you that you really need to think about your business models all the way through the process. The second thing is, how are you going to manage what will always be competition about who thinks that they own what? And so, everybody says, well, I funded it, I came up with it, I paid for for all the post-production, so I should be able to control the distribution. It's about me, if you're a documentary subject, so I should have some, ability to control things. The consumer obviously says, well, I went out and bought it, so I ought to be able to do whatever I want with it. This is a constant tension. It's a tension that happened in the analog world, and it's happening in the digital world. It becomes harder now, though, because you can make perfect copies, and because a lot of people are looking at some of the things that are done and not necessarily valuing it as something that has or should have a huge monetary value on it. And so you need to, again, educate yourself and those around you all the way through the distribution and creation channels so that you're not surprised. The bottom line, though, is you have to figure out what you want. And this goes to what I was saying about thinking like an innovator, which is you can't have it all. You think you want it all, but you can't have it all. So normally, any of your partners are going to give you a shot. They're going to say, what are the 3 things that you want? What's most important to you? And within limits, they're going to try and accommodate you. If they're interested in your content property, they're going to want to try and figure out a way to make that happen. But you can't have complete control and huge royalty rates and a big upfront payment and the right to participate in the back end and control of the copyright and the IP and all these things. So you really need to think about what is it that is your highest priority. And for some people, that's, I don't need to make a lot of money. I love this content property. I just am going to go with it and see what happens. But it's important for me to preserve control. Somebody else might say, I want to be a rock star. And fine, take my copyrights, take my publishing rights. Just make sure you give me enough of an advance and give me a bus, and I will go tour and be a rock star for 5 years. Somebody else says, maybe I want an annuity. I'm going to keep my publishing rights. And I think that this will have a long tail to what it is that's my content property. So you really have to sort of identify those things. And the other thing that's kind of tricky is that a lot of people usually make the calculus that number of sales or number of eyeballs equals the amount of money that I'm going to get on the back end. So if I sell 10,000 copies of my album, that's going to be better than if I sell 1,000 copies of my album. Well, if you need to sort of multiply that by the number because it may not be the case. So sometimes selling 1,000 copies but keeping all the money that's generated from that revenue may actually be a better business deal for you. And if financially you're trying to sort of make a living being a content creator, you really need to be smart about not just thinking about publicity and things like that. I often, when I give this presentation to social media folks, they always can't understand why anybody wants to shut down a viral hit. They're like, I just got you 10 million eyeballs. Well, 10 million times a 0 is still 0. And so if I'm somebody, if I'm not getting value out of something that just happened, I'm not actually getting, I mean, if getting viral and getting my name out there is important, right? That's what the South Park guys did, right? They sent around the Christmas card with the cutout animation, and it landed on somebody's desk, and they loved it. And there are lots of stories like that, but if that's not what you're trying to do, then 10 million times 0 is still 0. And so you need to sort of think about how am I going to manage that revenue flow? So I generally represent distributors or producers or all of those large media companies that I badmouthed at the beginning of the presentation. Those are my clients, generally. And, you know, they have their own sort of issues. And I think it's important to understand, yes, they are, you know, they want to take everything and sort of rape and pillage the content world, you know, absolutely. But there's some good reasons for that. And I want to tell you what some of those are so that you can understand the psychology of where they're coming from. Because when you are going to be coming to them usually as the supplicant, right? You are the one that's going to be on their paper, on their form. They're going to tell you what the deal terms are, and you're going to have to react to those. Occasionally, you know, you capture lightning in a bottle, and there's a bidding war for your movie at Sundance, but let's face it, that happens, you know, once every 3 years, you know. So once, yes, maybe just once, right. So you know, you have to then figure out, well, what is it that what can I get? I've already figured out what I want, and then what can I get? So I want to walk you through what the distributors are thinking of. So generally, they're betting on a slate of content. The whole idea is I am going to be investing in content the way that people invest in mutual funds. I am going to hopefully have your property become a smash hit, but really I'm buying 10 or 15 properties, and we're going to see what survives, right? Just look at the pilot season for every network. You know, they throw up 10 or 15 new shows. You know, they kill a couple of them within 2 or 3 weeks, and then a couple limp along, and they're 1 or 2 hits, right? That is the sort of classic distributor model. So you need to sort of figure out that you're going to have to be the one that takes care of your content, not them. And typically a distributor is trying to create some sort of brand around what it is that they're doing. And particularly if you look at like cable TV, you know, there is a brand around, you know, if I say Lifetime to you, you know what content is on Lifetime. If I say Sci-Fi, you know what content is on Sci-Fi. And these are networks and distributor platforms that have come up with ways to create a brand around the content that they're buying. But that is their goal. They want to make sure that the consumer remembers them, not you. And the other thing is that they want everything to be the same. They don't want to go back and forth 5 times with your term sheet and then have you negotiate the contract that they give you 10 times. There's nothing worse from a distributor's perspective than when the lawyer on the other side calls, because they're like, what? We thought this was a little small independent project, and now I've got to talk to a lawyer? That just created a whole bunch of friction, a whole bunch of overhead. I'm not sure how much I like that. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a lawyer, you definitely should. But you need to recognize that when you're creating friction in the process, by protecting your rights, there is going to be certainly an emotional response. Now, they'll get over that, but you need to be prepared for this sort of pushback, because what they really want is standardization. If you've ever signed an independent contractor agreement with any kind of organization, it used to be that they were short little 2-paragraph things, and then in the mid-2000s, they all changed dramatically because of a U.S. Supreme Court case. And the reason for that was because these large companies don't want to have to think about it once they sign the deal. They want all rights because they don't want to have to think about what rights they don't have, because nobody's going to pull this contract back out of the file. They just know they've got all rights so that when the opportunity comes up to sell a slate of movies to a television network, they just can do that because they know they have all rights. So you need to be thinking about the more ways that you can help them with standardization, the happier they're going to be. And then the other thing is that they're going to want to characterize your content the way that they want to characterize it, not you. If you think that yours is sort of a black comedy, they might think of it as a drama. And you just need to sort of get your head around that both the distributor as well as the marketing department for the distributor is going to self-identify that your content differently than the way that you probably self-identify it. And you know, one of the things about selling to a traditional distributor is that they're used to having absolute control. And so they get nervous about anything that is different from the traditional model. I was talking to a LA television producer last week, and she's trying to decide what kind of lawyer that she needed because she had a deal that looked a lot like a digital deal, but it also looked like it could go on TV. She didn't know what the outlet was going to be, and she was trying to figure out, well, what kind of a lawyer do I need to hire? My answer was someone up here because that's somebody who can do all these different things. But the difference is, if she's going to go on TV, the TV network's going to say, here is our deal. And there are 4 things that everybody negotiates it, and everybody in LA knows what those 4 things are, and then they negotiate it. When you have new entrants that come down, so when Microsoft first came down and went into Hollywood and wanted to turn some of their properties into music or into movies and things like that, they would go in and say, oh, we have a contract here. Well, you know, in the tech world, we negotiate every provision in the contract. We expect that we're going to be able to negotiate every provision in this contract. And as we've seen large organizations with lots of market power come into Hollywood and try and negotiate these documents that have been the same for 25 years, you've had this huge cognitive dissonance that has happened with lawyers and business affairs people within studios and things. They literally don't know what to do. They haven't had to negotiate a lot of these terms forever. And if they did, there's just a very specific way it all happened. And what happens with a lot of these new entrants, whether it's small people or digital disruptors or large organizations coming in to content creation and distribution, there's been a real sort of shakeup about all this. Well, what's happened is that everybody is really, really nervous about making a bad deal. So one of the things that we're seeing is everybody's doing really light deals, short deals, deals that give them lots of flexibility to get out, because nobody wants to be known as the person who cut the worst deal in Hollywood. I have a client of mine who insists that everybody in Hollywood knows that they have the worst TV production deal in Hollywood, and he's actually thinking about leaving his company. I mean, he's the general counsel of this company, thinking of leaving his company because he thinks that everybody in Hollywood knows that they have the worst TV deal, and they're going to think he did it. And so he's like, no, this happened before me. I've got to get out of here. So I don't know whether that reputation's true. I've only heard it from him. But if you are, again, you don't want to be that person, right, that cut that bad deal. The other thing about traditional distributors is that they often are looking at this transmedia play, this multi-platform play, as potentially cannibalizing their existing platform. So they are not necessarily thinking about a transmedia platform. They're thinking about, I'm doing this for TV, and you know, yeah, maybe we have some promotional webisodes, we'll have a nice little Facebook page with a like on it, but that's as far as we're going to go. This whole, like, we're going to integrate story, and so somebody has to buy, you know, a graphic novel in order to get the full value of the story. Well, wait a second, that's going to belong to somebody else's publishing company and things like that. And unless you're Marvel and you control every one of those elements, you know, the traditional distributor is going to look at that and say, this isn't how things work. I get the TV rights, somebody else gets the publishing rights, somebody else gets the, you know, theatrical rights to it, and we all go and do our own little thing, and we just try and not step on each other's toes. And of course, everybody, you know, they want control, they're risk averse, et cetera, et cetera. So then, you know, you get into the new distributors. So there are all of these, you know, Hulus and Vimeos and other folks of the world that have, and what we're seeing more and more now is this idea that these are niche players. So people are trying to build up content around a certain niche. So we're going to try and roll up some sort of genre music, genre film, or all sorts of casual games onto a certain platform, that kind of thing. Well, these new entrants need lots of content in order to get on the platform. And so they may be very willing to cut you a deal that is beneficial from a copyright ownership standpoint, from a rev share standpoint, from a control standpoint, but they will at the same time be they may not be capitalized, they're probably not going to want to spend a lot of money up front, so they're going to be thinking about ways that they can give you a rev share. And again, as I said before, a rev share of 0 is 0. So you need to know that they're actually making money. The other thing that's going to be kind of interesting about these folks is that they are often figuring out a business model. And that business model may change often sort of in a heartbeat. And so trying to figure out how you fit your license and your license of your content into that new business model is always relatively difficult. So what does that mean for you? So they're just the last couple of things I wanted to cover was the things that you need to think about when you're really in the term sheet stage. These are the big things to think about as you're going through. So the first off is, what are you giving them? What are the rights that you're giving them? And you need to be very specific about that, because rarely is anything an all rights deal anymore. Everybody is sort of carving these rights up. But you really need to think about, where are these rights going to go in the future? When we were doing digital deals 5 years ago, we would talk about online rights or internet rights or website rights or things like that. Well, people just often assumed that what mobile meant was that that was something having to do with the carrier. It was on-deck carrier distribution of content, whether that was music or games or video. If I say mobile to you now, 5 years later, we don't know what that means. You may think you know what that means, but I'll tell you the person on the other side thinks something different. And I'll give you a good example. How many of you think that the iPad is a mobile device? If I give you mobile rights, does that give me the right to distribute over the iPad? How many people don't? How many people don't want to raise your hand? Because it's terrible to raise your hand in a forum like this. I understand. My point is that you can buy an iPad that's got that's tied to a carrier. You can buy an iPad that's just Wi-Fi only. And I can, and why does an iPad as opposed to like an iPod Touch looks a lot like a laptop, but we would never say that if I access the internet on a laptop that would be a mobile device. So we have all this convergence and nobody knows what that all means. So it's important to be specific and to think about what the consequences are. And particularly if what you're doing is carving back from a full grant of license to the distributor, which is probably where you're going to be. I want to reserve my rights to do a casual game based on my content property, and you get all the rest of those. Well, a casual game may not be a social game. Those are now, if you're in the interactive industry, you'll know that these are diverging as platforms. So, you may be able to continue to do a casual game that shows up on Big Fish, but you can't do a social game that Zynga's going to produce for you. To mobile, I don't know. It depends is actually the right answer, and we've had that issue come up all the time. I represent E, and we had a question about the Kardashian iPhone app, and it was when we had rights that were clear when it was only available on the iPhone, but when the iPad came out, we had all these questions now about whether or not the scope of the rights that we had from either the Kardashians or from the content property or from their production company, whether or not they were going to be sufficient that we could push out this content, our TV content, through the iPad app. And so we went through a whole bunch of mental gymnastics. They called me, and I gave them my wisdom, which, that and a nickel gets you 5 cents. And we just made a guess. And so we just took a position, and then nothing ever happened. And that's one of the things that definitely happens within these categories, is that people are trying to figure out, they're doing deals that are short enough with small enough amounts of money that they can sort of wait and see how these things shake out. So we still see a lot of people tiptoeing around. So anyway, thinking about the scope of the license and thinking about the future. Money, you need to think about ways that you're monetizing your content and all the different ways that you can do that, and then the ways that you're getting paid if somebody else is monetizing your content. And it's important to think about if you are getting paid on the upstream, somebody else is monetizing your content. I often care less about what that percentage number is, and I care a lot more about what that percentage is of. So I would spend a lot less time worrying about whether it's 5% or 10% or 25%, and worry a lot more about what the definition of net revenue is. And what we're seeing on digital platforms, as opposed to in traditional media, you can actually negotiate that. If you've ever seen a traditional studio film deal, the definition of net revenue is about 14 pages, 14 pages for a single definition. And that's where you get these whole sort of fixed fees for, $10 for a DVD, for cost of production of a DVD, even though it's now, a nickel and stuff like that. And then the last thing is just to think about a couple of other key terms. Exclusive versus non-exclusive, I mentioned that earlier. You really need to think about, do I want to tie myself to a certain platform? Do I love this platform? I want to get married to this platform, or do I want to continue to have the right to distribute across multiple platforms? The upside is, if you go exclusive, they should give you more money. You should always get more money if you're giving away an exclusive. The downside is, if you bet wrong, you are tied to that platform, and you could have been successful on another platform. Termination, figure out how you're going to get out of the deal. What happens if the distributor buries your content, doesn't promote your content? What are the marketing obligations under the content? And then what are your remedies for that? Typically, distributors are not going to make any guarantees about what they're going to do to their content. The people signing the deal with you, or people who are convincing you to sign the deal, will tell you that their company are going to do all sorts of things to promote your content. I will guarantee you that the language in the contract does not say that. And when it gets to the marketing department, they will make a separate decision about that. So figure out what happens if your content is buried and how you're going to approach that. And then what kind of future constraints have been placed on you? And there are all these things like MFNs, most favored nations, right of first offers, right of last offers, right of last refusal, all these different things that basically say I get sequel rights, or if you have another property, come to me and we'll talk about it. And what's interesting is, in a multi-platform world, you might give somebody sequel rights, but you may actually decide that you're going to come up with a concept that is in the same world that's been created, but is completely separate from the story that's been created. Brandon Sanderson, who is a science fiction writer, just wrote a new book that takes place in the same universe, but 300 years later from when his original sort of book series happened. Is that in the same universe? If I have sequel rights, is that something that, as the distributor, I'm entitled to, or is that something that I should be able to then go and handle separately? So you really need to watch these things, because what every distributor wants is, if you become a star, they want to hitch their wagon to your star. And so they want to make sure that they've got as many hooks into you as they can, so that they can take advantage of the next J.K. Rowling and the next woman who wrote Twilight, whose name is escaping me at the moment. Thank you, Stephanie. So anyway, that is more than my allotted time, but I will stick around, and if you have any specific questions, but otherwise, I think we're done, and I'm supposed to release you.